Okay, brilliant. And thank you for joining us, everybody. So good afternoon and welcome to a Chiltern Teaching School Hub in combination with Pioneer Learning Trust RQT session. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Nichola and she's going to go through a session with you today on SEND in the mainstream classroom. Just want to bring a couple of things to your attention. And we are recording today's session to go on our YouTube channel for the rest of our colleagues. So if you don't want anything that you've said today to be included in that, please let me know at the end of the session. If you want to get involved and speak at any point during today, you have a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you also have a question and answer box. So if there's a function, if you want to talk to other people and add information, you can pop that in the chat box, or if you'd like to ask a specific question to Nichola or to myself at the end, you can pop that in the question box. So I'm now going to introduce Nichola. Nicola's from Pioneer Learning Trust, and she's going to lead you through today's session.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Cheryl. Firstly, welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time out of what I know are very busy days for you all to join me. Just to introduce myself, my name is Mrs. Nichola Comben. I am currently the interim head at Selford Primary School. However, I have picked up the SEND role now for about 10 years. I started working with children that were looked after, and it then slowly evolved into looking at children with additional needs. That then became my role as an inclusion manager. I've worked up through assistant head, and that's kind of allowed me to spread my knowledge across schools within the trust. Being part of the MAT means that I can access a lot of support from those schools, but it means that I can also give back, and I've worked with the staff and support staff in those schools. Lovely, thank you very much all of you for attending, and as Cheryl said, please do use the chat function if you have any questions. I'll try and answer them as I go through. If there's anything that we can leave to the end, we'll do that. I will be asking for you to respond at times to different questions or just different thoughts that I've got, really, looking for you to participate where you can. Don't feel pressured into doing that, but it's always quite nice to have some response so that I know kind of where I'm pitching is right, and I know that you're kind of feeding into the conversation too. This is the first part of a two sessions. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can join me with where we are. As I said, it's the second part. The aims of this session really is to understand SEND in the mainstream classroom. It's about getting a big picture, really, of what that looks like, of the different children who we work with every day, what their needs look like, and it's the ability to really notice those first signs. I'm sure that many of you have either joined schools in the last couple of years, or maybe you've been working as a support staff. I know they've got some support staff that have joined the webinar this afternoon. Today's session really is about giving the opportunity to develop your ability to notice when a child needs some additional help, and also to really differentiate the difference between a child who may be just displaying behaviours that are typical of their development and children who are displaying behaviours that mean we need to do a little bit more work to support them. So as it says on here, our aims will be to identify a range of needs and ultimately ensure that you're confident in understanding how these special educational needs and disabilities can have an impact on children's ability to access the curriculum and their learning opportunities. And hopefully by the end of it, you will have an understanding really of your duty as individuals, but also as a school and practitioners to implement the SEND Code of Practice. And I will be referencing the SEND Code of Practice throughout the session today. It is something that guides SENCOs within schools, but I think there are areas that it's really important teaching staff generally are aware of, just to make sure that they're including those things in their everyday teaching practice. Okay. The session after this, and it won't be, I think, until about next month, is going to be delivered by Coralie Bordiak. As I said, today is about understanding SEND in the classroom. She's going to be following that up with looking at strategies. She's going to be looking at managing SEND in the classroom, strategies to support particular needs, and I'll go through some of those needs in my session today. She'll be looking at resources that might be useful for you to be using, maybe things you haven't thought of, and she'll also be looking at the strategic use of TAs in the classroom. So there's your two sessions. Today we're understanding what needs look like. Next session, we're addressing how to support them in the classroom. Okay. So we're going to start off with, I'm just going to move my box over to there. We're going to start off with looking at the SEND Code of Practice. Some of this is quite wordy, apologies for that, but it is how it is laid out in the SEND Code of Practice. And as I said, it's really important that you're aware of what your role is in the classroom. So it's identified that high quality teaching that is differentiated and personalised will meet the individual needs of the majority of children and young people in your classroom. And that's part of your daily practice. It's understanding which children might need a little bit of scaffolding in their learning, which children can be challenged further to develop some more independence. It's really important, though, to very quickly understand what support some children need in addition to that. So some children and young people need educational provision that is additional to or different from this. So it's something more that you're going to put into your classroom to support the needs of identified children. This is a special educational provision under Section 21 of the Children and Families Act. Schools must use their best endeavours to ensure that such provision is made for those who need it. Special educational provision is underpinned by high quality teaching and is compromised by anything less. So as that sets out in the SEND Code of Practice, is all of our responsibility as staff in education to make sure that children are given what they need. It says under their teachers must use their best endeavours to make sure that a child with SEN gets the support they need. It means doing everything they can to meet those needs. And teachers must ensure that children and young people with SEN engage in the activities of school alongside pupils who don't have SEN. So that's where that inclusion comes from, and that inclusive approach. Okay. The Code of Practice talks about the early years providers and schools knowing precisely where children and young people with SEND are in their learning and development. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are looking at this, looking at the terms SEN. The term that is used across all schools is SEND, because we do recognise that actually having a disability requires the additional support as well. So apologies for those of you looking at that thinking it should be an SEND, you're quite right. We should be ensuring decisions are informed by the insights of parents and those children and young people themselves. Parents play a very big part in what we do for our children with additional needs. It's really important that we're transparent, not just with our teaching staff, but with our parents. It's important that they feel included in the processes that we're putting in place for their children in school. It's important we have high and ambitious targets for children. Just because children aren't necessarily at the same level as their peers doesn't mean that we can't challenge them against their own benchmark. We need to track their progress, and we need to have goals. Coralie will talk about the use of targets and the use of things like IEPs in her next session, but it's recognised that children who need a little bit of additional support work best if they are working towards an identified goal. We need to promote positive outcomes in the wider areas of personal and social development. Quite often we find children that struggle within the classroom, struggle with many aspects of their learning. We need to ensure that the approaches used are based on the best possible evidence and are having the required impact on progress. So that basically means anything we're putting in place for these children, we are identifying whether or not they're working, we're identifying what the impact of that is, and if it's not having the impact that we want, then we're reviewing and we are making changes where necessary. I just want you to have a little think, and as I said, please do use that chat function where you can. I just want you to think about where you are already doing this. So if you want to share some of your ideas, how are you ensuring that you are noticing children's areas of need? What are you doing to support them? Have a quick think. I'm not going to give you too long, so I'd like to move on. But just in yourselves, in your own settings, what are you doing? Have you already identified children that need something additional? Are you communicating with parents? Do you have ambitious targets set for those children? And are you ensuring that what you're doing is effective and has impact? Okay. So the first thing we really need to look at this session is identifying a need. In the SEN Code of Practice, it says the identification of SEN should be built into the overall approach to monitoring the progress and development of all pupils. This time I would like you, if you could, to add your ideas to the chat. Obviously, if you're watching this as a recording, you are unable to do that. How do you go about in your day-to-day practice identifying additional needs that children may have? I'm just going to give you probably about 20 seconds to have a think. Please do put those responses in if you can. What do you use to identify children with additional needs? Who do you talk to? Where might you get that information from? Okay, so I'm just looking down here. Thank you very, very much. So I've got some responses here, having a set time that a TA can work with a group of children within their targets. That's wonderful. And also the feedback that we get from our support staff is invaluable. Thank you very much. I've got some responses there where children can actually identify their own progress. So that self-assessed approach is brilliant. Verbal feedback during the sessions from children, but also from support staff. Sharing documents among specialists. Thank you very much, Erin. It's really important. I'm very aware that when we get children in a new year, we get given a lot of information in that transition process, and it's very easy, especially if we have a transition before the summer term, to kind of put all that information somewhere really important that you're going to look back and review at some point. But often, if we're not careful, we miss really important things like specialist advice. And hopefully there is somebody in your school, your SENCO, who's able to coordinate that and readdress that and make sure that you're really accessing the advice that you need to. Speaking to the SENCO, that's part of that transition process. If you've got a child coming to you with known needs, then a SENCO will hopefully identify that, and maybe previous staff. If you have concerns yourself, maybe speaking to the SENCO, that might be what's meant there. Grades then given. So yeah, by teacher assessment, by staff assessment in the school. And I think that continuous comparison between children, and I'm not saying for a second that we should be comparing, but ultimately there'll be an expectation of what children should be working at, what kind of levels, what grades children should be working at. And you can notice the children that maybe aren't quite there. So thank you very, very much for your feedback. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look. This slide certainly isn't exhaustive. These are just a few things that a lot of you have said already. We talked about assessing children. So I know at my school we have pupil progress meetings on a regular basis, which gives the opportunity for teaching staff to talk to the SENCO and also to senior leaders. And that's a really good opportunity to look at kind of hard data and notice trends, notice where children maybe aren't where they should be, notice a continuous trend of a child who is working below an expected level. And that's an immediate indicator that the child may need some additional support. Somebody's already said feedback from support staff. Really useful to ask, and I know we don't have time. Even with my own staff at school, we recently spoke about how one of the biggest barriers to communication and effective support is lack of time and lack of feedback from staff. And if you've got a member of staff working really strategically with a group of children and they've done some great preparation, they've got some great work out of those children, it's such a shame if that then isn't able to be fed back to the staff, to the teaching staff. So I would say and we're trying to do that in our school at the moment, one of the key things or key areas to make time for is that quick communication with your support staff in the classroom. Obviously, there may be more formal times during reviews that you can have those conversations too. Conversations with parents. I don't think anyone picked up on that in the chat, but it is really important that we're listening to our parents. There will always be parents that like to give us lots of information, lots of concerns that they may have for their children. And as professionals, it's about taking that information, having a conversation with your team, maybe bringing it to the SENCO, and having a conversation about what parts of that conversation then need to be actioned. Is there something that needs to be put in place immediately? Is there a bigger piece of work that needs to go on? We do have occasions, and actually there's been more of it this year, where parents have addressed concerns with the class teachers, and class teachers might not see anything immediately. They might say, oh, there's nothing that I can identify in the classroom. We've got a confident child in the classroom, really accessing the curriculum well, but the parents have got ongoing concerns about how that child behaves at home. And I think it's really important to value the information that is given from parents, because it's absolutely possible that a child is presenting very differently in different environments. And if we're dismissive of that based on what we see in the classroom, then we're not going to have the trust from that parent, and we're not going to create the relationship that we need to move forward and make sure that we've got the right support in place. Termly assessments, we talked about looking at children and children's grades. I know that some people talked about levels there, and we also talked about handovers to previous class teachers, but also previous schools. Schools are very good at transferring files and informations. Some of us do that electronically now rather than having to do it via files, paper files. And that's even easier because a lot of that goes straight onto a system and you've got it there to hand that you can refer back to. Okay, so good job. I don't think any of that on there is anything that will be a surprise to anyone. Most of those things are things that you do on a daily basis. You don't necessarily have to prepare yourself for doing them or prompt yourself to do them. They're part of a natural school day and natural practice. So I just want to move forward from there and look a little bit more at how we identify need in the classroom. So you've got your new class for the year. You might have been told about a couple of children. You've got things with resources in place for children with particular needs that have already been identified. As you go through the term, there will always be children who you very quickly pick up on and look at and think, oh, there's something there. I might not be able to put my finger on it, but I know that I might need to do something additional for that child. You've had a conversation maybe with the SENCO or with support staff, and there's been an agreement that, yeah, there's something not quite right. Let's take it further. We need to put some support in place. So what are those indicators? That's really what I want to get to in today's session, is what do we see in the classroom that should be making us think there's a reason for a conversation about that child. It's very easy in teaching, especially when you're very busy, you've got a lot going on, you've got lots of children probably needing you, wanting you, especially when you haven't quite established those routines as at the beginning of the year. It's very easy to dismiss what you see in children's behaviours and in the way they present themselves in the classroom, just as a child who might be being a bit needy or might be being a bit clumsy or they just haven't settled yet. We tend to make a lot of excuses initially for children when we notice that there's a difficulty. And it's really important, I think the key message to take from today is use those immediate signs as a trigger to get something in place, even if initially it's just monitoring, but it's those small initial signs that you need to pick up on. So let's just have a look at what those signs might be. Again, this is just an idea of what you may see in the classroom, and I know very well that there'll be a lot more in addition to this. So some of these pictures representing the top there, you've got a parent who might be persistently coming to you and questioning what a child's doing in the classroom, maybe questioning the child not able to do their homework, the child that's a bit reluctant to go into school in the mornings and is happy to be in school, but it's a bit of a struggle every day to get them in. And lots more information we can get from parents. At the bottom there, that symbol is really just looking at what we're seeing in the classroom when we're assessing work, whether we're formally assessing it or whether we're carrying out teacher assessment based on observations. How accurate is that child in their learning? How often are they making errors? And is it on a regular basis? Is it a misconception that could be quite easily addressed? Or on a regular basis, is that child getting something very similar wrong every day? Is it about the fact that they haven't understood what they're being asked of? Is it that they have understood what they're being asked of and actually they're rushing through their work and making careless errors? Okay, so it's just probably one of the first things we would look out for as teachers is, are the children getting it right? Are they accurate with what they're learning and with maybe their verbal responses in the classroom? At the bottom there, quite obvious, you've got a sentence written back to front and inside out. Is that typical for the age of the child? Obviously, if we've got children coming up into year 1, we're looking at them using their phonics to try and decode and to spell. That's absolutely appropriate for their age. If that continues into Key Stage 2 and we're still seeing reversal of letters, we're still seeing a real jumble of words and actually to the point where the child can't read it back, they don't really know what they're writing, an immediate indicator. And I'm not talking about just a little bit of poor spelling, although it is really important to look at a child who is consistently spelling and making spelling errors, because there may well be a difficulty there that hasn't been picked up on, or that isn't presenting itself in its full capacity, but something you might want to keep an eye on. At the top there, you've got a group of people. That's just representing the information we get from additional agencies and agencies that we work alongside. Senkos do a fantastic job, and I'm not saying that just because I've spent a lot of my life being one, but they do a fantastic job at coordinating provision outside of school as well as inside of school, and they've always got connections to speech and language therapists, to child development centres. We have got autistic spectrum disorder teams. We have our SENS team, which is our special educational service, needs service, which I know is based in Luton. And I'm very aware that different authorities differ with what they can offer, but ultimately there'll be a range of agencies that schools can contact, and that can also give us information. There are occasions where I get referrals or reports from outside agencies about children who I haven't done a referral for, and that information I can use to then further look at the child and think, actually, yeah, we have noticed some of that. Then we can move forward to put some support in place in school. Some of the behaviours that children, some of the way that children present themselves are indicators that there is a difficulty. Not just a behavioural difficulty, but actually a learning difficulty. And when I talk about SEN, I talk about any additional need, not just special educational need. It's not about their educational learning. It's any additional need that is providing a barrier to their learning. So we've got a little figure there in blue with his head hung low, noticing a change in mood of a child, noticing that the child is feeling a lot lower, maybe withdrawing from a classroom, maybe a child who is quite isolated on the playground. Within the classroom, you might not notice anything, but just noticing when you're on duty that as a child consistently just wandering around the edges of the playground on their own. I'm not saying that there is something that needs to be done maybe in the classroom, but there may be an additional need there. There may be something that we can put in place to support that child, and it may be something that has a social element and that is put in place when the child is in that kind of playtime environment. And then we've got children who we are very aware of, and I think typically we would have called them daydreamers. Years ago, they would have been the children, or they're away with the fairies. They like looking out the window. It's that child. Actually, what's that behaviour telling us? Is that a child who just can't be bothered and a child who is being lazy? Or is that a child who finds it very difficult actually to focus for long periods of time on quite detailed information, to the point where they're having to shut down their thinking in order to kind of protect their brain function and the capacity? So it's about identifying these needs, but actually looking at what they might mean. Other behaviours that often are trying to tell us something, children that show a lot of frustration. And I don't think I've ever had a year or a class where I haven't had to speak to or manage or support a child who has communicated their needs through their frustrations, through their physical behaviours. Children don't typically come to school to get cross, but I'm very aware we have a lot of children who for some reason get to a point in the day where they feel very frustrated. That has many reasons and actually isn't a quick thing to solve. It's not a very simple thing to look at and put a solution in place for. It's about unpicking what's going on for that child, looking at whether or not those frustrations are linked to their learning, whether they're linked to their ability to access the work that they're given on a daily basis, whether those frustrations are linked to social skills, not being able to communicate those needs otherwise. Their vocabulary, have they got the ability to communicate, use the words to communicate how they're feeling? That's why they're communicating through their behaviours. And then you've got a child at the bottom there on the right hand corner, and I think we get lots of children in the classroom who you'll look at during the lesson, and it's perfectly normal, and I do throughout the day. I probably pull that face myself, and I will look at my colleagues and I'll think, oh, I've had enough, I can't do any more today, because I've actually reached capacity. I've reached a point where I need to go and regulate myself, often with a cup of tea, and I need to stop and just have a breather. And I think it's really important to recognise that even very well attentive, very pleasing children, very compliant children sometimes get overwhelmed with the stuff that we're teaching them and with the content that we're trying to feed them. So it's about recognising that might be a child that just needs something very small, short, sharp pacey pieces of work, but with breathers in between. Okay. There are many other pictures I could have put up there to represent the differing needs that we might come across and pick up in the classroom. All this is about is being observant. It's about looking at your children, recognizing patterns in their behavior, making a note of something that doesn't sit quite well with you. And if you have some kind of reporting system, and I know that across a lot of schools in Luton, especially within our trust, we use CPOMS, which is an online management system for recording instances and child protection instances. It's a really good place to put some of those observations on, because it's there you can build up a pattern, and you can look back over time and say, actually, this is quite a common occurrence for this child. What's going on? What do we need to do? Okay. I haven't looked up. Has anyone got? I haven't got anything in my chat, so that's brilliant. If you do have questions, please remember to use that chat box. I will look at them every now and then. Cheryl is looking at them as we speak, so if she thinks that anyone's raised anything that needs addressing here and now, she will flag that up with me. Okay, so moving on from observing behaviours that we know maybe aren't quite typical to trying to classify what some of these behaviours are. Now, I just want at this point to state that I am not a paediatrician. I am a teacher in the first instance, and I have spent a lot of years working with children with a range of needs. So I have become very aware and very familiar with what some of these things look like. A lot of these definitions I have just got from sort of generic places, some of them from Google, although I have fiddled with them with things that I don't particularly agree with. My point is, I don't want you to use these lists of criteria as a diagnostic tool. They're not. And in order to make a diagnosis under any of the areas that I'm going to address now, requires referrals to specialists, and it requires an element of assessment and intervention in cases where a diagnosis is proved or disproved. Okay, so please don't take this away today and go, well, I've got a child that does that in my classroom. Look down my list and say, well, they must have this because Nichola said that this is what a child that displays behaviours like that is. That's not what I'm asking you to do. The reason I'm giving you this information today really is to make you aware of the fact that these things are out there. They are huge barriers to children's learning. We have more children being diagnosed with some of these difficulties more now than we ever have done, and I don't believe for a second that's because we do have more children with some of these difficulties. I think it's that we're better at picking them up, and we're better at picking them up because teachers generally and support staff are better at identifying at those initial stages, so we're able to get in there quickly. Okay, there is an argument for a label, and I speak to a lot of parents on a very regular basis about whether or not it is important for a child to have a label to identify their needs. There's a mixed response. There's not a right or wrong answer. For some children, it's a protective factor. It ensures that they get the support that they need. And it also ensures that staff in their future and in their future schooling have an understanding of what that need looks like, so that provision can be put in place. Some children need that diagnosis to get additional things like additional funding and maybe additional resources to support them as they go through their education and into young adulthood. There will always be an argument, and some parents have it themselves, why they don't want a diagnosis for their child. Parents generally don't want their children to be labelled, and I do understand that. Sometimes it's not the best thing for the child. We have had children who have been given a diagnosis based on their presentation, and actually that's done the opposite to supporting them. It's almost being used by parent in some instances as an excuse, and you're not able to put the provision in place and make the progress that you're able to, because the child is constantly kind of deferring back to having a difficulty, and it blocks their ability to make progress. That's not something that I come across as often now, but I certainly have had children in the past who giving them a diagnosis, especially if it's not been completely necessary, if it's been a kind of, I'm slightly on the edge as to whether or not it's needed, and maybe an EP or a pediatrician hasn't been quite sure, but because of the parents' insistence, a diagnosis may have been given, and it's not always the best thing for the child. As I said, it's not up to us as practitioners in school to make these decisions, thankfully, but it is important that we have an idea and we generate the right information. So we're going to start with dyslexia. Dyslexia is something that has been around, or the term has been around for many, many years. Quite often you hear of adults saying, oh, I really struggled at school, and now I've had a diagnosis of dyslexia. Dyslexia is a learning difficulty, as it says on the screen, that affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. So it's about recognizing words. For some people, it's just about letters, the combination of letters on a page. Children that do have a diagnosis of dyslexia, or are sometimes referred to as having a dyslexic profile, will often have a phonological awareness or a difficulty with, that means that hearing sounds and hearing letters, they don't necessarily hear and look at the corresponding letter and make a connection. We have a lot of children who struggle, and although they may not have a diagnosis of dyslexia, there is a definite difficulty with their association between a phoneme, kind of what the letter sounds like, and the grapheme, what the letter looks like. And until you get that link, you can understand why reading might be really difficult for a child. Verbal memory. So this is the ability to retain and order sequences of materials for a short period of time. If you think about reading requires the ability to order. It requires the ability to hold information, letters in a word, hold that information, hold that letter in your head, look at the next letter, work out what it says, add that to the bigger picture. Even just reading simple words needs, sorry, I don't know if you can hear, there's a Hoover going on in the background. Cheryl, if that's disturbing or distracting for anyone, can you let me know? Verbal memory, see, my memory's now gone. If a child isn't able to hold information in their head, they're not able to string ideas and concepts together. And reading is just an example of that. We often, and again, this is probably one of the first indicators years ago of dyslexia, was confusion between their hands, the reversal of letters. Sorry, I'm just going to see if this person is, oh, lovely. Thank you for letting me know you can hear. They're getting closer to my door. The reversal of letters in sentences, B's and D's, are very typical that children may get wrong. I think it's really important, as I said earlier, to look at what a typical development of a child is. If you've got children down in reception year 1, 2, and I would even say as they enter year 3 and they've got some letter reversals, it's about some overlearning, getting some strategies in place where the children can really remind themselves. I mean, one of the things that I remember doing for children was actually a picture of a bed and being able to make kind of these shapes and remembering that the B was at the beginning of the bed and the D was at the end of the bed. And for that child, that worked really well. Some children use their hands, and they as soon as they make the letter with their hands, they remember which way around the letter goes. So actually, with some incidences like that, we're not looking at identifying a full-blown diagnosis. We're just recognizing there's a need, putting a strategy in place to support that particular difficulty. Dyslexia can have a far larger impact, however, on children's learning than that. And I just want to have a look at what else we might notice in the classroom. There are lots of examples here going right the way from reception. We're in a primary school here up to year 6, but actually I would say that some of these indicators can continue into adulthood if children, young people are struggling. So in the early years, difficulty learning nursery rhymes, the child that might just kind of hum along or nod along to a song or a nursery rhyme, but really find it difficult to produce the sounds and the words. And I'm not talking about the child having a speech difficulty. I'm talking about the child being able to articulate the words, but really not being able to remember the order of those words, even through sing-song. And even through rote learning and kind of a lot of repetition, they're still not quite getting it. Children that can't remember the letters of the alphabet, children that sing the sound of the alphabet and the song of the alphabet, but never quite get the letters in the right place. And maybe each time they say the alphabet, they're getting the order slightly different. Children having trouble recognising letters, reading or writing. Dyslexia really has a huge impact on children's ability to communicate through reading and writing. For some children, the reading is there and actually quite accurate, but it's the writing, it's the getting it down on paper. You might find these are the children with lots of ideas in their heads. They're really good at verbally giving their ideas, having a discussion, introducing real kind of story-led fictional ideas, really imaginative to the class. But when it comes to writing their own piece of work, they really can't get it down on paper. And for some children, if that's left unidentified, it becomes a really big barrier. And for some of our children, really affecting their confidence. We've got a child in year 3 at the moment who has found writing really difficult, and we're trying to get him just to enjoy the experience of writing. And at the moment, he can write anything. He can write a story about, as long as it vaguely links to what we're doing, he can write a story with any kind of characters in, because I'm just really keen that he has a go at writing and knows that he can achieve. Difficulty reading or a particularly slow rate of reading. As children get older, and we would expect their fluency to increase, it's those children who really are still poring over those letters, children really still having to decode, maybe split the word up or sound the letters out before they're blending the word back together. It's not a sign on its own, and actually none of these signs on their own are kind of indicators of a dyslexic profile. Having said that, if you've got a particular concern about a child really not being able to read year on year and their reading not making any progress, then that indicator on its own might be enough to bring it up to a specialist, or at least have a conversation with your SENCO. Failure to understand what they read, so that's their comprehension. Often, because even if they've managed to decode the words and read them out, they're so busy working on decoding and blending that they've actually forgotten the previous words that they've read in that sentence, because they're not able necessarily to hold that information in their head. Misspelling easy words, that's something we see quite frequently in practice. Struggling to follow simple instructions, again, maybe not being able to hold that information in their heads. Trouble with writing, messy handwriting, misusing simple words, so putting words in the wrong places in sentences, or using a word, they know exactly what they mean, but they've used completely the wrong word in the context of the sentence. Deficiency to remember or learn new words. So we teach and pre-teach vocabulary. It's really important that those children have a visual of that vocabulary, and that you're really readdressing it time and time again before they might have to use it in a piece of work. And at the bottom, it just means their vocabulary, again, is particularly limited. Okay, I'm very aware of the time, and I do have a few of these to get through, and I do really want to take you through to some links, just to give you an idea of what some of these children are seeing, not all of them, but what children might be seeing when they look at pages of text. So this is just a task. Please join in with it. I'm not expecting you to write down anything in the chat for this. If you want to scribble on a piece of paper, that's fine. On average, an adult can copy 20 words in a minute. I'm going to just show you a screen, and if for some reason I can't share it, then I know Cheryl is on hand to do that for me. There we go. I just want to give you a couple of minutes to see how much of that you can read and how easy that is for you to read. Now, children, not all children with dyslexia, but children with a dyslexic profile have real difficulty with their tracking, or can have difficulty with their tracking. And that means that for some of our children, letters don't stay still on the line. Not only do they not stay still on the line, but they quite often look like other letters as that child is reading. So we just talked about a child maybe having a slower speed to their reading. If you look at something like this, you can quite quickly understand why. If a child is having to reread words because in their mind, letters look different, and I'm not suggesting for a second that letters on the pages of the work that they're looking at are changing, but because they haven't got tracking, they're actually losing track along that sentence. If you then think about trying to read and then comprehend what you've read, you can again see where the barriers are. This is a really good thing to take back to your schools and to share with staff, really to bring home the difficulties that some of our children are having. That's just a copy of what I have just been sharing with you, although that is a still. In the one I've just been showing you, the letters have been moving. But quite quickly, you can see again how difficult it might be to read if you're not recognising letters as they are written. Okay, something that follows on quite, don't mean nicely in that respect, but from dyslexia is dyspraxia. Often you get a comorbidity of difficulties. Dyspraxia and dyslexia often go hand in hand. That doesn't mean for a second that a child with dyslexia will have dyspraxia, or vice versa. They can be two separate entities on their own. Dyspraxia, a learning difficulty that affects movement and coordination that causes a student to appear clumsy. I remember children when I was at school being referred to as being clumsy, and I would be quite confident in saying that there are people on this webinar who have referred to a child in their classroom as, oh, they're always, they never look where they're going, they're always walking into tables, they're always bumping into children. What's going on for those children? The children that are on the play areas and actually seem to fall off and bump their head quite frequently. They're always getting some first aid for a little bump or a scratch. At what point do we need to start picking up on that and saying, is that just a child who is unfortunate, or is there something else going on? So we're looking at fine motor skills. We're looking at their ability to coordinate themselves and their gross motor skills. So if they're walking and jumping, just their hand and eye coordination. Are they able to get themselves dressed? Can they put hats on? Can they do buttons? Are they able to put their coat on their own? When they are putting their coat on their own, are they standing still, or are they wobbling all over the place? Their motor planning, so remembering and performing steps to make a movement happen. So if there's something that they're having to regularly do, whether it's in the playground with regards to moving through equipment, do they know how to maneuver themselves around that equipment? In PE, if they're learning a new skill, catching a ball, are they able to understand that I couldn't catch it last time because my hands were too open? I'm this time going to put my hands closer together. I also need to know to bend my fingers around the ball when I catch it to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Are they able to coordinate those moves so that they're effective in catching that ball? Structure and sequence. Dyspraxia doesn't necessarily all need to be about their coordination physically. It can be about their thinking, and some children do struggle with dyspraxia with the structure and sequencing of their ideas, organising their ideas for writing. And I know that Cobley's going to go on to strategies later on, but these are the children for who doing things like mind maps and doing a lot of visual things, making sure things are in particular colours to indicate different concepts. That's really useful for children that need their thinking a little bit more organised. So what might you notice in your classroom? You might notice that a child is having a particular difficulty learning something new. In PE, the child that actually doesn't make it from one end of the bench to the other on a regular basis. A child that prefers fantasy games or talking to actually doing things, so they might be a little bit shy, go to the back of the line if you're doing a PE activity that they're not too confident with. Excuse me. A child that struggles to learn exercises or steps or routine. Again, in dance, in your PE lessons, a child that finds it really hard to do that clap and then that jump and then that turn. Difficulty with organising motor activities that require multiple steps. So that's physical things that require a bit of a chronology, but it might be their organisation of their thoughts when they're having to hold more than one piece of information in their head. A child that finds drawing, colouring or copying more challenging. Again, look at what's typical for the age development range. You've got a child in year 1 and 2, you're not expecting them to be colouring necessarily within the lines, but you would expect by the time a child has got to year 3, year 4, to be able to manipulate tools to a good degree. A child that has trouble playing with fine motor activities, threading, typically in the lower years, you would do that as part of child initiated learning. As children get a bit older, you might notice that a child that can't put puzzles together, again, children that aren't able to do their own zips up or do their own laces up. Poor skills in ball activities, I've spoken about that. And generally a child that might be getting frustrated because of any of the above. A child that's finding it really hard to access any of those activities, and it's coming out, they're communicating it by becoming frustrated. Okay, as I said, that's not an exhaustive list. There might be other things, but if you do notice any of those, it's really important to keep them up, keep a note of them. If you need to kind of note them down somewhere, as I said, you might use an online system as we do, and just have those conversations with other members of staff. What have you noticed? If you notice that that child does that when we go out to play, and then have those conversations with key members of staff, bring it up with your Senko, have a conversation with the parent. Does the child find putting their socks on difficult at home? How's the child with doing their coat up when they're at home? It might be they just don't want to do it in school and quite like the TA doing it for them because they want to be quite good friends with that. So just unpick a little bit about what's going on for that child. Okay, the last thing, and that I could talk, I mean, I couldn't in an hour, but I could talk about lots of different things. I've chosen 3 things that I think you're more likely to come across in the classroom. The last one being autism spectrum disorder is what we used to call it. It's changed slightly and the terminology is now autistic spectrum condition. I will use ASD and ASC interchangeably throughout this PowerPoint, only because I'm still getting used to calling it ASC. Fundamentally, it's the same thing. So autism spectrum disorder, a lifelong developmental disability that affects the way a person communicates. It is a barrier to a child's ability to communicate effectively. And I'm not talking exclusively about speech and language being the difficulty. It's their ability to socially communicate and relate to people, and actually for some children, relating to the world around them. Okay, just checking on the clock. The term spectrum is used as the condition will affect different people in different ways. If anyone out there has got children in their classroom where you've noticed some slight difficulties, maybe with their social communication, maybe some just things in their behaviours that you wouldn't deem particularly typical, you might already have started thinking, there's a barrier there, there's a difficulty there, but I don't quite know what it is. The reason it's called a spectrum is because some children can have very small factors that have an impact on small elements of their day, but generally they can access the learning environment, they have friendships when they're on the playground, and those difficulties don't have an impact on their day-to-day living and their functioning. Some children on the other end of that spectrum have great difficulties with managing their ability to understand the world around them, with their ability to socially communicate with people, and also to understand, to receive information from situations around them, from people around them. And it really does impact their day-to-day living. And I think that's the point really where we need to look at understanding and identifying what the difficulty is. And for some children, it's really important that they do get that recognised and they do get that diagnosis at an early stage, so that the right help can be put in place and so that they can start to be understood. And I've known a lot of parents who are actually quite relieved if they've had years of really struggling with a child, trying to manage their behaviour, maybe trying to manage the frustrations that they're seeing that child present with, because they just can't communicate their thinking and they can't understand the world around them. Everything's scary, everything's overwhelming or just confusing. And for some parents, when they get that diagnosis, it's a real relief because they feel they're being understood and they feel their child is being understood. So yes, I was talking about spectrum, and I've got a diagram for you in a minute to just unpick what that spectrum really looks like and what it's made up from. Some children, as it says on there, will not have a diagnosis, but they might be termed as having a social communication disorder. It might only impact certain elements of their learning and of their daily life. Children typically with ASD have difficulties, as I've already said, with communicating, with processing dialogue, understanding the meaning in somebody's conversation, especially if the information that they're being given is a little bit abstract. So if somebody is telling them something where they need to really unpick and read between the lines, a lot of our children with ASD we talk about as having quite literal understanding. So they will take the words at face value, which might not be as they're intended. Children typically misunderstand facial gestures. They may not give facial gestures. They certainly might not understand humour or idioms. They could also have difficulty socialising. as I've said, maybe working in groups. So the child that never really takes part in that group session, the child that's more reserved, or the child that actually really wants to communicate with the rest of that group, but hasn't got the understanding of the kind of the social rules, the kind of the turn taking, the knowing when to back down and let somebody else have a turn, or the appropriateness of when to respond to someone. So yeah, we can see children kind of with ASD working at both those ends of that spectrum. We do have children that become very frustrated, and you can understand why. If you've got a child who really isn't making their point known, feeling really confused with the world and not able to articulate that, it's going to make them feel quite frustrated. As I've said before, they don't have that flexibility of thought. They have quite narrow interests. They might have obsessions, and actually for some of our children, those obsessions and that narrowness of their interests is about them being able to take control over small elements of their world, and it helps them regulate themselves by making sure that some things are in their control, because they don't have control of the wider world. And as it says at the bottom there, autism spectrum condition becomes a concern when it is a barrier to learning and functioning. So you might have identified some things within your classroom. They might not be at that point a difficulty or a barrier to that child learning. There are lots of children we have in mainstream school who, some do have a diagnosis, some don't. Some children have that social communication disorder diagnosis, but it doesn't have a huge impact on their learning. So we don't need to put anything additional in place in the classroom. It might be that a child has some identified difficulties, but they never quite get that diagnosis. There you go, that's what I want. So for those of you that can see, I've got a short video here. Please, if you want to take the opportunity, if you can't see my screen, you want to take the opportunity to watch this now, I'm going to start it now. So if you want to start it now as well, it's only about 1.5 minutes long. But this is just giving you a little bit of an insight, some of you may have seen it before, into what a child who has got a diagnosis of autism spectrum condition experiences. And this is a child with heightened sense of sensory, heightened sense of sense. So they are very receptive to being overly stimulated by noises, lights and things and sounds around them. So please watch it now if you can see my screen.
Six, 7, 8, 9. Take my hand.
No, Alex. It's fine, isn't it?
I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
So that film, and I've used that quite a few times, it really demonstrates how some of our children are affected by what's going on around them. And I'm very aware that classrooms are very busy. Classrooms, even the most well-managed and routine-based of classrooms, can appear quite chaotic to some of our children. And if they're overstimulated, then they are just not able to, and some of them aren't able to articulate that. You can see in that video that the way that child communicated his frustration and his feeling of overwhelmingness was to show it with his behaviour. Okay. I was given this in some training that was delivered actually by CAMS a couple of years ago, and I thought it was a really good way of understanding autism as a spectrum. And the idea is that there are several areas that all of us could kind of assess ourselves by. And again, the idea is that everybody could place themselves somewhere on each of these areas to create this spectrum. We've got children who we might identify as being, with regards to their IQ, particularly gifted, and children that really struggle with their learning and might have an element of learning development need. The social interaction, you might get children, as I described earlier, who are very overactive, very involved, very wanting to dominate conversations, but those children who equally are quite removed from social environments. Communication, this is about their actual ability to articulate. So you might get children that are very verbal, who like to regulate themselves by talking a lot and talking about lots of things that they're interested in. You again may get children on the other end of that spectrum who are non-verbal. We've had children in mainstream school who we haven't managed to have verbal communication with, so we use a lot of pictures and images to do that. Emotional understanding. Again, children with very little understanding of their own emotions, children who can be very, might use the term, if I want a better word, emotional. So it's a child's inability to regulate that element of emotion. Motor skills. As we looked at with dyspraxia, the same kind of difficulties can be seen with the child with autism. Again, you can have that comorbidity where a child is particularly coordinated and maybe very good at their fine motor to make quite intricate models and things like that. But again, a child who may be very uncoordinated and really have poor fine and gross motor skills. And then at the bottom there, and the child in the video that we just watched there, their reaction to a sensory environment, so whether they're very hypersensitive. Again, you might get children who are very hyposensitive. Often we have children who are on the autistic spectrum. If they have an injury in school, we get some of our children who, even for a very small bump or a scrape, may be very difficult to manage because they feel the pain. It's very sensitive. We get children who might have a real collision on the playground, and they won't talk about whether it hurts or not, and actually they could have quite a significant injury. So it's about being aware of that. And again, if you've got a child who has had a real fall on the playground and doesn't seem to be moaning about it, just be aware of that. That's not particularly typical. Okay, very aware of the time. I just have the last area. I did say there were 3 areas that I was addressing. I'd forgotten. I put this in here at the last minute, so I do think it's really important that we just consider the identification of children with a profile of ADHD. And I've said it in that respect because actually I'm finding that more practitioners are diagnosing attention deficit as well as a hyperactivity disorder. There are lots of new terms being bandied around at the moment. Typically you'll hear attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is your ADHD, but you can get the ADD without the hyperactivity or the impulsive element. And those are children often that are at the other end of that spectrum and might appear quite withdrawn and inattentive. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through this. I've got a chart for you, and then I'm going to leave it there. So we're looking at children with a learning difficulty that is characterized by either inattentiveness or hyperactivity and impulsiveness. So as I said, they could be either end of that particular spectrum. Students typically have difficulties with their concentrating. This is the child with maybe poor time management, comes into school late in the morning, and that might be for other reasons, but it might be their own inability to manage their time. Children that frequently lose things. Oh, I can't remember where I put my PE kit, or I did have a sock and it was in the classroom a minute ago, but now I can't find it. Children that make maybe careless mistakes. They try really hard to get their work done, to get it completed on time, but actually often it's quite messy, it's quite rushed. And I think that last bit about children that have quite impulsive natures, the child that calls out, the child that's off his seat all the time, desperately trying to give you and please you with the answers that you've asked for, but not being able to actually sit and process and wait for their turn. We have a lot of children who might, the child that gets out of his seat all the time, and it might just be to walk around the classroom. It might be to go and get a pair of scissors from the other end of the classroom, even when they've got them on their own table. It's that need for constant motor. The way I explain to some of our parents with ADHD is that a child typically is processing information at a much higher rate. So those synapses are firing, they're having to impulsively act on those thoughts before they've actually got time to rationally sit and think, do I need to get up? Do I need to answer back to that? Or can I sit and process what I'm thinking without having to say it to anybody else? Some of our children don't have that ability to process, so they are constantly firing. They're the children that definitely need their playtimes. Children that are more inattentive, often ignoring, they might seem a bit anxious. As I've said at the bottom, our focus is to be aware of what types of special needs are the most common and the characteristics that might be indicators. This is the first step of implementing the right support. And I've just got a table here for you really to take away, and again, not use as a diagnostic tool, but just to use as a little bit of a checklist in the back of your mind. You've got a child who appears either as inattentive or hyperactive. The inattentive child might have a short attention span. In fact, a lot of these kind of cover both areas. They might overlap. A child that's easily distracted, again, careless errors in their schoolwork, appearing forgetful or losing things. The child that appears to not be listening to what you're saying, even if you're standing in front of them and talking, they might have brilliant eye contact with you, but you can see that they're not processing what you're saying. The child that's unable to stick to a task, and it might be that task is repetitive, it's tedious, or it's time consuming, so their mind has wandered. The child that's constantly changing activity, you ask them to get a book to read and they go and get one, look at the front cover, come and sit down, seconds later they're up changing it. They can't focus and maintain that focus. And a child, again, having difficulty organising their tasks. Some of the things you've probably seen in the classroom with regards to hyperactivity and impulsiveness, children not being able to sit still, especially if the surroundings are nice and calm. You've got a nice, quiet, calm session happening on the carpet. You may be reading to the children, and they're the child that's fiddling with their laces, or the child next door to them laces, or the hair of the child in front of them, or they're unbuttoning and buttoning up their jumper. They need to be fiddling with something all of the time, constantly fidgeting, being unable to concentrate on tasks, excessive physical movement all of the time. You've heard the term, they've got ants in their pants. It's that kind of won't take a breather, won't sit still. Not being able to wait their turn often cause that impulsiveness, often getting quite negative behaviour, negative responses from staff. And I understand why we need to make sure children know what the expectations are, but it's again making sure we're understanding maybe where that's coming from. It's not necessarily a child just being rude, just wanting your attention. There's something else going on there. That bottom one, having little or no sense of danger. Often when I speak to parents, they'll say, yep, he straight across the roads, doesn't tend to stop, doesn't look out for cars. So actually there's quite a lot of concern around a child that isn't assessing the environment to look for danger. Okay. I am very aware that I have flown through some of that. Please do contact Cheryl if you want me to go over anything else. As I said, a lot of the stuff from today's session is not an exhaustive list. I've tried very hard to kind of compact quite a lot of information into a very short period of time. The last slide, I'm just going to whiz to here, is about reminding ourselves what we're expected to do. We're expected in our roles to make these identifications, to understand which of our children need that support, but then to action something, to put something in place to support them. As I've said, Coralie in her next session will be looking at support strategies and all of the things that you can do once you've identified those needs to support those children in your classrooms. Thank you very much for your time. Have a safe journey home. And as I've said, please do make contact if you need it. Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Thank you ever so much for a great session, Nichola. If anyone has got any burning questions, please pop them in now. Somebody's just asked, Nichola, if there's a possibility for them to have a copy of the slide for outside agencies.
There was. I'll just go back and show you very quickly what that was. I didn't feel like I needed to. Oh, I can't go. Oh, you've got the screen, haven't you? Yes, it was just the outside agencies that we use within Luton, but I can certainly either give that to you to email out, or I can I'll speak to you afterwards, Cheryl, and see if I can actually get the slides out to people. I think that might be.
We'll pop it out and we'll add it onto the YouTube recording as well, so it'll go out to everybody. But thank you for joining us this evening, and a massive thank you to Nichola for such a great session.
Thank you very much.